The day aliens realized humans were real and totally unstoppable. The station floated at the edge of neutral space like a cold metal island. It had no flag. It belonged to no one. That was why both sides had agreed to meet there. The Kynthian collective had used it before many times with many species. The meetings always ended the same way. A smaller, weaker civilization signed the papers. The collective got what it wanted. Everyone called it diplomacy. Ambassador Vel-Kar arrived 3 hours early. He liked to be settled before the other side walked in. He liked to already be sitting, already be calm, already be in control of the room before the first word was spoken. He had done this for 30 years. He was very good at it. He sat at the head of the long curved table and reviewed his notes one more time. And the species was called human. They came from a single planet in a quiet corner of the galaxy. Their civilization was young by any standard that mattered. They had faster-than-light travel, but only barely. They had weapons, but nothing that would trouble a Kynthian warship. Their population was large, but spread thin. They had no allies out here, no treaties, no protection. The briefing file used the word primitive 3 times. Vel-Kar thought that was probably 1 time too few. He set the file down when the door slid open. 3 humans walked in. The one in front was a man of average height with a steady walk and dark eyes that moved across the room the moment he entered, taking everything in without making a show of it. His uniform was plain and dark. A small flag patch sat on one shoulder. His name, according to the file, was Commander Jake Harris. Behind him came a woman named Lieutenant Kara Webb, carrying a data tablet and walking with the quiet focus of someone who had already read every document in the room twice. The third was a man named Sergeant Dan Cole. He was broader than the other 2, with the kind of stillness that did not come from being relaxed. It came from being ready. Vel-Kar gestured at the seats across the table. "Please sit," he said. His translation collar carried the words smoothly into their language. Jake pulled out a chair. He turned it slightly before sitting, angling himself so he could see both the table and the door. He did not look at the gesture as a power move. He simply looked like a man who always knew where the exits were. He folded his hands on the table and waited. Vel-Kar had expected fidgeting. Most species fidgeted at this table. Their delegates would arrange and rearrange their documents, pour water they did not drink, glance at their advisors too often. It was a sign of anxiety, and anxiety was useful. It meant the other side already understood the difference in power between them. Jake Harris did not fidget. He simply sat and waited, and his eyes were calm. Vel-Kar cleared his throat. "The Kynthian Collective has reviewed your species' request for formal recognition within our governance framework. We have found your civilization to be at an early stage of development. Integration into the collective would bring your people significant advantages: trade access, medical technology, infrastructure support, most importantly, protection under collective law." Jake nodded once. "And what does the collective want in return?" "Compliance with collective law and governance, a standard taxation arrangement, and military contribution when called upon by the Council." "Military contribution," Jake repeated. "Service, yes, it is standard for all integrated species." "You mean conscription?" Vel-Kar paused for just a moment. "We mean contribution to collective security." Jake looked at Kara. She did not look up from her tablet. He looked back at the ambassador. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly. You are asking us to give up our right to self-governance, pay taxes to a council we have no seat on, and send our soldiers wherever that council decides. In exchange for the significant benefits I described, yes. And if we decline?" Vel-Kar folded his hands. Then the offer changes." "Changes how?" "It becomes less of an offer." The room was very quiet for a moment. One of the Kynthian advisors along the wall shifted his weight. Dan Cole, standing near the human side of the room, did not move at all. Jake leaned back in his chair by a small amount. Not a retreat, more like a man settling in. Ambassador, I appreciate your time and I want to be honest with you. We came here in good faith because we believe in talking before anything else. We are open to agreements. We are open to trade and shared security and building something real between our peoples. But we are not going to sign anything that takes away our right to make our own decisions or that sends our people into a war they did not choose. Velkar studied him. The words were direct, not angry, not desperate, just clear. That he had heard versions of this speech before from other species. It was usually the last show of pride before the reality of the situation became too heavy to ignore. You are brave, Velkar said. Or perhaps you are simply not yet aware of what the alternative looks like. We are aware, Jake said. We just believe there is a better option than the one you have described. Velkar slid a data chip across the table. The full terms are on that. You have 48 cycles to review them. After that, the Council will expect a response. Jake picked up the chip. He looked at it for a moment, then set it beside his folded hands. We will review everything carefully. See that you do. Velkar let a thin smile cross his face. It was the smile of a man who had done this many times and already knew the ending. I have 48 cycles is generous. I suggest you use them well. Jake stood. He buttoned the top button of his jacket, which had been open, and he nodded. Thank you for meeting with us. He turned and walked toward the door. Kara fell in beside him. Dan Cole was the last one through. He glanced back once, not at Velkar, but at the room itself, measuring it the way a soldier measures a space. Then the door slid shut and they were gone. Velkar sat for a moment in the quiet. Then he turned to his chief advisor. Thoughts? The advisor tilted his head. Standard resistance posture. They will review the terms, find that there is no realistic alternative, and return within the 48 cycles with some small modifications they want on paper so their council can claim a partial victory. We grant 1 or 2 minor points. They sign. It is done. Velkar nodded. That was how it always went. He picked up his own notes and began writing his log entry for the session. He described the human delegation as cooperative in tone, but unrealistic in expectation. He noted that a single standard fleet demonstration near their outer colonies would likely accelerate compliance if the 48 cycles produced no agreement. He marked the mission status as pending and set the file aside. He did not notice, as he wrote, that no one on his side of the table had been able to make Commander Jake Harris blink. He did not think it was important. He would think about it later, much later, when everything had already changed, and he would remember that calm and wonder how he had looked at it and seen nothing at all. The day aliens realized humans were real. And totally unstoppable. The 48 cycles passed slowly on the station. The Kynthian staff went about their routines. The advisors filed reports. Velkar took his meals in his private room and read his briefings and waited for the message that would tell him the humans had made their decision. The message came on the final cycle. It was short. Commander Jake Harris requested a second meeting. He did not say whether it was to accept or to negotiate further. Velkar assumed it was acceptance. They always accepted by now. The weight of reality had a way of settling on a species during those 48 cycles. They would look at their fleet numbers. They would look at the collective's fleet numbers. They would do the math and arrive at the only conclusion the math allowed. And he confirmed the meeting and went to sleep with the easy confidence of a man who already knew how the morning would go. Jake Harris arrived on time again. The same 3 people. The same quiet walk. Kara Webb with her tablet. Dan Cole near the door. Jake at the table with his hands folded, and that same unhurried calm that Velkar was beginning to find mildly unusual. We have reviewed your terms, Jake said. And you accept, Velkar said. It was not entirely a question. No, Jake said. The room went still. Two of the Kinthian advisors along the wall exchanged a glance. Velkar kept his expression flat and his voice even. "Then what is it you are proposing, Commander?" Jake reached forward and placed a data chip on the table. He did not slide it aggressively. He simply set it down. A counter-proposal. Open trade access on equal terms. No conscription of any kind. A joint security framework where both sides have equal voice and veto power. Shared intelligence on threats that affect both our peoples. We sit at the table as partners. Velkar looked at the chip, but did not pick it up. You are not in a position to negotiate as partners. With respect, we disagree. Commander. Velkar's voice was patient, but firm. Your entire fleet is fewer than 300 ships. The nearest Kinthian fleet group alone has over 2,000 vessels. Your weapons systems are projectile-based. Your ships are slower than our courier vessels. You have no allies in this region. You have no treaties. You have nothing that gives you standing to make demands of the collective. Jake was quiet for a moment. The quiet was not uncomfortable for him, and it was the kind of quiet a man used when he was about to say something important and wanted it to land correctly. Ambassador, can I ask you something? Velkar opened one hand. Go ahead. Do you know what Earth's surface gravity is? The question was so unexpected that Velkar blinked before he could stop himself. It is in your planetary file, approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. That is correct. And Kinthia Prime? 6.1. So your people have lived and trained under 6.1 their entire lives. Every soldier, every worker, every citizen, 6.1 from birth. Jake paused. Our people have lived and trained under 9.8. Every human who has ever walked, run, lifted, worked, or fought has done it under a gravitational load that is nearly 60% heavier than what your soldiers experience every day. Velkar said nothing. He was listening now in a way he had not been listening before. Kara Webb turned her tablet around and slid it across the table. On the screen was a document. It was dense with numbers and comparative charts. Velkar leaned forward slightly. The document showed human biological data alongside 6 other species that were already part of the collective's military structure: bone density, muscle fiber composition, recovery time after injury, pain response thresholds, cardiovascular output under sustained effort, fatigue timelines measured in hours of continuous high-intensity activity. The human numbers were not just different. They were different in a way that made the Kinthian advisor to Velkar's left stand up slightly from his chair to get a closer look. What are we looking at? Velkar asked. You are looking at what happens when a species spends hundreds of thousands of years evolving on a high-gravity world full of things that were trying to eat them, Jake said. You are looking at bone structures dense enough that human soldiers can take impact forces that would shatter the limbs of 3 of the 6 species on that list. You are looking at a cardiovascular system that can sustain high output for hours longer than anything the collective has seen from comparable body mass species. You are looking at pain tolerance ranges that our own doctors still argue about, because the upper end of what a human can function through is outside what their models predicted was survivable. The room was very quiet. The Kinthian advisor, who had stood up, sat back down slowly. He was still reading the document. This is not a threat, Jake said. I want to make that clear. We are not sitting here trying to scare you. We are sharing information because we believe that if you understood what you were actually looking at when you looked at us, this conversation would go differently. He leaned forward just slightly. We are not the small, soft species in your briefing file, Ambassador. We are something that your briefing file did not have the information to describe correctly. Velkar looked at the data for a long moment. Then he looked at Jake. Even if everything in this document is accurate, and it does not change the difference in our fleet sizes. You are right, Jake said. It does not. But it changes the calculation of what a conflict between us would actually cost, and we think, if you are the kind of leader we believe you are, you would rather know the real cost before any decision is made. There was a long silence. Velkar picked up the data chip Jake had placed on the table. He held it for a moment without looking at it. "I will review your counter-proposal," he said. "That is all I am committing to at this time." "That is all we are asking," Jake said. They left the same way they always did, quietly, without looking back. Velkar watched the door close and then turned to his advisor. The advisor was still looking at the tablet screen. He had not moved since he sat back down. What do you think?" Velkar asked him. The advisor looked up. "I think," he said slowly, "that we did not read their file carefully enough." Velkar took the tablet and looked at it again. He stayed with it for a long time. Outside the viewport, stars drifted past in the slow rotation of the station. Somewhere far beyond them was a quiet planet with an unremarkable sun and apparently a surface that had been building something extraordinary for a very long time without anyone out here knowing about it. He set the tablet down and reached for the counter-proposal chip. He told himself he was only going to glance at it. He read it 3 times. The day aliens realized humans were real and totally unstoppable. Nobody planned what happened on Cycle 6. It did not come from any order or strategy. It was not an escalation that either side had arranged. It started with a young officer making a bad decision on a patrol route, and it ended with a piece of camera footage that changed everything. The Kynthian patrol vessel was running a standard route near the outer edge of the neutral zone when it picked up a signal from a human survey ship. The survey ship was small, built for mapping and data collection. It had no weapons. It was crewed by 3 people, a pilot, a systems officer, and 1 security observer who had come aboard as part of the diplomatic mission. The security observer was Sergeant Dan Cole. The patrol captain's name was Greth Vor. He was young, ambitious, and not entirely familiar with where the neutral zone boundary actually ran on that particular approach angle. He looked at his sensor display, but decided the human ship had crossed into restricted space, and made a decision that would have been the right call if his reading of the boundary had been correct. It was not correct. The human ship was inside neutral territory by a margin of several hundred kilometers. But Greth Vor did not double-check. He gave the order to board. 8 soldiers went through the airlock in full armor. They were not expecting a fight. They were expecting 3 civilians who would put their hands up the moment the Kynthian soldiers came through the door. That was how these things usually went with smaller species. Show the armor, show the weapons, wait for the hands to go up. They came through into the main corridor of the survey ship and found Dan Cole standing in the middle of it. He was not in armor, he had no firearm, and he was holding a collapsible baton extended at his side. He was standing with his feet a little wider than his shoulders and his weight slightly forward. He was not saying anything. He was looking at them the way a man looks at a problem he has already started solving in his head. The lead soldier told him in Kynthian to stand down. The translation collar on the wall of the corridor carried the words into his language. Dan Cole looked at the collar, then back at the soldiers. "This ship is in neutral space," he said. His voice was level, not loud, not shaking. "You do not have the right to be here. Leave the way you came and we will call it a navigation error." The lead soldier raised his weapon and stepped forward. What happened next lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. The ship's internal cameras recorded every frame of it. The Dan Cole moved first. He did not wait for the soldier to close the distance. He closed it himself, which was the last thing the soldier expected, and the baton hit the inside of the weapon arm before the trigger was reached. The weapon went sideways. Dan was already past it, past the soldier, putting the first one between himself and the others the way water moves around a rock, smooth and without hesitation. He fought the way he had been trained to fight, which was efficiently and without any of the hesitation that comes from wondering whether the situation is really as serious as it looks. He already knew it was serious. That calculation had been done the moment the airlock opened. 6 of the 8 soldiers went down in those 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Then 2 retreated back through the airlock and sealed it from the other side. The 6 on the floor were breathing. None of them were in danger of dying. Dan Cole had been precise about that. He had put them down hard enough to end the fight and not one bit harder. He stood in the corridor when it was over. He was breathing hard. There were 3 cuts on his left forearm from the edge of a soldier's armor plating. One side of his face was bruised where something had connected. He was not moving with any sign that the bruise bothered him. He looked at the sealed airlock for a moment, then turned and walked to the communications panel. "Cole to Harris," he said. Jake Harris's voice came back almost immediately. "Go ahead." "We had a boarding attempt. 8 soldiers. They came in without warning. The ship is secure. I have 6 of them on the floor, and 2 that went back through the lock." There was a short pause. "Are you hurt?" "Cuts on my arm. Nothing serious." "What about our crew?" "Locked in the rear compartment. Safe. No contact." "Stay put. I am contacting the station now." The footage reached Velkar within the hour. He watched it in his private room with his door closed and no advisors present. He watched it once all the way through without stopping. Then he went back to the beginning and watched it again, this time pausing at several points to study the motion more carefully. Then he called his chief military advisor and had him come to the room. The advisor watched it twice without saying a word. When it finished the second time, he stood there in the quiet and stared at the still image on the final frame, that which showed Dan Cole standing alone in the corridor with 6 armored soldiers on the floor around him. "He is not exceptional," Velkar said quietly, almost to himself. He was remembering what Commander Harris had said in their first meeting. "You are not looking at what you think you are looking at." The advisor spoke carefully. "The movement patterns, the transitions between opponents. He was not reacting to each one individually. He was managing all of them at once, using space and positioning to prevent them from grouping on him. That is an advanced technique. Our best hand-to-hand instructors teach something similar. But the way he absorbed impact, there were 3 separate strikes that landed cleanly on him. Any one of those would have ended the engagement if they had landed on one of our soldiers in that same armor configuration." The advisor turned to look at Velkar. He kept going as if they had not happened. "Because of the pain tolerance," Velkar said. "It is the only explanation." Velkar stood up and walked to the viewport. The station rotated slowly and the stars moved in a long arc outside the glass. He stood there and thought about the data sheet Kara Webb had put on the table. He thought about the numbers he had read on the counter-proposal chip 3 times in a row 2 nights ago. He thought about the way Jake Harris sat at a table without fidgeting and waited. He picked up his communication device and connected directly to the human delegation's channel. Jake Harris answered. "Your sergeant," Velkar said. "Is he all right?" Jake asked. Not what did he do, not what is the situation. The first thing out of his mouth was asking if his man was safe. "He is unharmed. My soldiers are being treated. Commander, I need to ask you a direct question." "Go ahead." "Is what I saw in that footage typical for your military personnel?" There was a brief pause on the line. Not a long one. Just long enough for Jake to decide how honest to be. "Dan Cole is good at his job," Jake said. "He is not considered exceptional by our standards." Velkar closed his eyes for one moment. "I see," he said. "Ambassador, I would like to come in. I think it is time we finished the conversation we started." Velkar looked at the frozen image on his screen. 6 of his soldiers on the floor, 1 human standing. "Yes," he said. "Come in tomorrow morning. I will have the council room ready." He ended the call and stood very still in the quiet of his room. He had been in this work for 30 years. He had sat across from frightened species and struggling species and species that wept when they signed the papers. He had always known what he was looking at. He was no longer sure he knew what he was looking at. That feeling was new. He did not like it, but he respected it. And for the first time since the human delegation had walked through that door, Velkar began to think that maybe the outcome of this particular meeting was not as settled as he had assumed. The day aliens realized humans were real and totally unstoppable. The council chamber looked exactly the same as it always had. Same table, same chairs, same faint smell of mineral oil and cold recycled air. The same viewport on the far wall showing the slow rotation of distant stars. But the feeling in the room was different this time. Velkar had noticed it the moment he sat down. His advisors were sitting straighter. Their eyes were a little more careful. The easy confidence that had filled the room during the first two meetings was still there, but it had a small crack running through it now, like a heavy plate with a hairline fracture that has not yet broken, but that everyone in the room can feel. Two senior council members had joined Velkar this time. That alone said something. They had not bothered to attend the first two meetings. They were attending this one. The humans arrived, and the room changed again. In the way a room changes when people walk in who are not carrying any of the weight you expected them to be carrying. That Jake Harris brought a fourth person. She was a woman named Captain Amy Grant. She was compact and quiet, with steady eyes and the kind of stillness that came from spending a lot of time in rooms where staying calm under pressure was not optional. She sat beside Kara Webb and said nothing during the early part of the meeting, which suited the moment because there was a great deal that needed to be said before it was her turn. Jake began with the boarding incident. He laid it out plainly, what had happened, where the ship had been, what the patrol captain had done. He did not raise his voice. He did not use it as a hammer. He stated the facts in the same quiet way he did everything else, and then he stopped and waited. Velkar acknowledged the error. One of his senior council members added a formal statement of regret. It was brief, but it was genuine. Jake nodded and said that the matter was noted and that the humans wished to move forward. That was when the real conversation began. Velkar placed the counter-proposal chip on the table. He had reviewed it 6 times. His advisors had gone over it in detail. They had found it well-structured, more sophisticated than they had expected, and built on a framework of actual equality rather than the kind of paper equality that smaller species sometimes tried to argue for and never got. "We have reviewed your terms," he said. "There are sections we find acceptable. There are sections we need to discuss." "That is what we are here for," Jake said. They went through it point by point. Trade access moved quickly. Both sides wanted it. The language around military cooperation took longer, and the collective's existing framework assumed a hierarchy. The humans had written their framework around mutual consultation and shared authority, with neither side being able to commit the other's forces without formal agreement. It was a clean concept. It was also something the collective had never agreed to with any species, and 2 of Velkar's advisors made that point clearly. Jake listened to the objection and then said calmly that the reason no other species had asked for it was probably because no other species had been in a position to ask for it and have it make sense to both sides. He said it without arrogance. He said it the way a person states a fact about the weather. The room went quiet for a moment. Then Velkar said he would like to take a short break, and he and the senior council members stepped out. But they stood in the corridor and spoke in low voices for several minutes. When they came back in, the advisors who had been pushing back on the military framework said nothing more about it. The conversation moved on. At some point, one of the Kinthian advisors turned to Amy Grant, who had been sitting quietly taking notes, and asked if he could ask her something off the record. Amy looked at Jake. Jake nodded once. The advisor asked about Earth, not about the government or the fleet or the trade numbers. He asked about the planet itself, the animals, the old ones, the dangerous ones. Amy set down her stylus and leaned forward with her elbows on the table. She talked for a long time. She talked about the ocean and what lived in it. She described creatures the size of ships that breathed air and sang to each other across distances of hundreds of kilometers. She described things with teeth built to crush bone, things that hunted in packs and used strategy, things that struck from ambush and things that ran prey down across the open ground over the course of hours, because their bodies were built to outlast anything they chased. She described the ones that looked harmless and were not. She described the ones that had been there since before the first humans stood upright, and the ones that had only survived because humans chose to protect them. The advisor was writing things down. Both senior council members were listening. Velkar had stopped looking at his papers. She talked about the ice ages, so when the cold had spread across most of the planet, and the species that could not adapt had vanished, and the ones that found a way through got stronger. She talked about the diseases, the ones that had swept through human populations and killed enormous numbers, and the ones that humans had eventually hunted down and destroyed with medicine and will, and the stubborn refusal to let anything just win. She talked about the volcanoes and the floods and the long dry periods when the land offered almost nothing and people survived anyway. You do not think of your world as a dangerous place, one of the senior council members said quietly when she paused. Amy considered that. We have national parks, she said, places we set aside so the land stays wild and the animals stay free. We take our children there on holiday. We hike through them. We sleep in tents. She smiled just slightly. We think of our world as home. It is a beautiful place. It is also a place that spent a very long time testing us before it let us build anything permanent on it. We passed. The room was quiet. Velkar looked at Jake. Tell me something honestly, he said. When I told you the offer would become less of an offer if you did not accept, were you concerned? Jake thought about it. We were not happy about it, he said. We would not have wanted a conflict. But no, we were not concerned in the way you probably meant. Because you believed you could win. Because we knew what a conflict would cost you, and we knew you did not know that yet. We came back to talk instead of waiting to see how the math worked out because we genuinely did not want either side to pay that cost. He paused. That is the truth. Velkar was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I believe you. He picked up the counter-proposal and wrote something at the top of the first page. He turned it around and slid it across the table. At the top, in the cramped angular script of Kinthian formal notation, he had written a single word that translated loosely as accepted as a basis. Jake read it. He did not smile widely or show relief. He just nodded, and the tension in the room came down slowly, like pressure releasing from a sealed space, and for the first time in 3 meetings, something felt like it might actually be possible. They worked for 4 more hours that day. Nobody left early. Nobody hurried. When they finally stopped for the evening and agreed to continue the next morning, Velkar walked to the door with Jake and said, without planning to, Your world sounds extraordinary. Jake looked at him for a moment. It is, he said simply. You should visit sometime. Velkar watched him walk down the corridor and thought that perhaps he would. The day aliens realized humans were real and totally unstoppable. The final agreement took 11 more cycles to complete. It was not easy. None of the best things are. There were long nights at the table where the language of a single clause became the center of a 2-hour argument. There were moments when both sides went quiet, and the quiet stretched so long that the station's ventilation system became the loudest thing in the room. There were 2 occasions when Kara Webb set her tablet down very deliberately and said nothing, and Jake Harris leaned forward and spoke in a low, direct voice that brought the conversation back from the edge and into workable ground again. No one on the Kynthian side ever asked what he said in those moments, because the effect was clear enough. The conversation continued. Velkar's senior council members pushed back hardest on the joint veto clause. They had never agreed to anything like it. They had sat across from over 40 species at this kind of table, and the collective had never given any of them a true veto over collective military action. It went against the entire structure of how they worked. Jake did not argue. He did not get frustrated. He explained the same point in slightly different language each time they raised it, patiently, as if he had all the time in the universe. He said that the clause was not about limiting the collective, and it was about building something neither side could break alone, which made it worth more than any arrangement held together only by the threat of force. He said that what they were building here was not a leash. It was a foundation. On the 9th cycle, the senior council members stopped pushing back on the veto clause. The taxation section was easier. The humans had brought a detailed economic analysis showing trade projections over a 10-year window, and the numbers were genuinely good for both sides. Kara Webb had built the document, and she walked through it with a precision and patience that eventually won even the most skeptical Kynthian economic advisor, who by the end of the session was asking her questions about Earth's manufacturing infrastructure with the focused interest of someone who has just realized they may have significantly underestimated the size of a market. Dan Cole spent most of those 11 cycles in the station's gymnasium or walking the corridors. He was not needed at the table. That was not his role. But word had gotten around after the incident on the survey ship, and the Kynthian soldiers stationed on the level above the gymnasium had developed a habit of gathering at the observation window that overlooked the main floor each morning. They watched Cole run his routines. They watched him move through training drills alone, working with the collapsible baton or just with his hands and feet against the heavy resistance bags bolted to the wall. And they did not say anything. They just watched. Some of them started arriving a few minutes earlier each day so they could see the beginning of the session. One of them, a young soldier who was technically supposed to be on administrative duty at that hour, was found at the window by his supervisor on the 3rd day in a row. The supervisor started to say something sharp about duty schedules. Then he looked through the window at what the soldier was watching. He stood there for 4 minutes without saying anything. Then he quietly reassigned the soldier's administrative duty to a different time slot. The signing ceremony was small. Both sides had agreed they did not want something large and performative. A big ceremony felt like theater, and what had been built here was not theater. It was real, and real things did not need a show. Velkar stood at the table with Jake Harris. Kara Webb and Amy Grant were there. 2 of the Kynthian council members stood behind Velkar. The room was the same council chamber where the first meeting had taken place, and the table was the same table, and the mineral oil smell was the same, but the feeling in the room was nothing like it had been on that first day. They signed. Both pressed their marks to the document. A camera on a small tripod recorded it. No speeches were made. Velkar had considered preparing something and decided against it. Jake had apparently made the same decision. When it was done, they looked at each other across the table, and Velkar extended his hand in the human gesture he had seen Jake use at the start of their 3rd meeting. Jake shook it firmly. "Good work," Jake said. "Aye on both sides," Velkar replied. The room emptied slowly. Amy Grant walked out with the Kynthian economic advisor, the 2 of them still talking about freight corridor routing as if the signing had been a brief interruption in a conversation they intended to continue for a long time. Velkar walked to the viewport after everyone had gone and stood there alone. He looked out at the stretch of space beyond the station glass. Out there, past the neutral zone markers and the patrol routes and the long dark between stars, was a system he had once described in a log entry as unremarkable. A quiet star, a mid-tier planet, a young civilization that had not yet understood the power differential between itself and the collective. He had been wrong about most of that. The planet was not mid-tier. He understood that now. And a world with that gravity and that history of hostile biology and that geological violence had not produced a mid-tier species. It had produced something that came to a diplomatic table without fidgeting, that sent a single unarmed soldier against 8 armed ones, and had that soldier come out standing, that talked about its dangerous and beautiful home with the easy pride of people who knew exactly what they were and were not embarrassed by any of it. He had almost sent a fleet. He had written it in his log on the first night. A single standard fleet demonstration near their outer colonies would likely accelerate compliance. He was glad the fleet had stayed where it was. He turned away from the viewport and picked up his documents for the next session. And there was already a follow-up meeting scheduled for the first joint trade convoy coordination. The Kynthian economic advisor had requested that Kara Webb attend that one specifically. Vel Carr had already approved it. Jake Harris had left the station that afternoon with a short goodbye and no fanfare. He had filed his reports, briefed his crew, and boarded the transport back to Earth on schedule. From what Vel Carr understood of human culture, he would probably write a summary for the diplomatic record and then take a few days off before the next thing began. Vel Carr hoped he rested well. He had earned it. He also hoped, in a quiet way, that he would not have expected to feel a month ago that they would meet again at this table. Not because of a crisis or a conflict or a term that needed renegotiating, just because the conversation had turned out to be one worth having. Out beyond the station, in the slow dark between stars, the first joint human-Kynthian trade convoy was already being planned. 30 cycles out, it would leave from a human port and cross into collective space carrying goods that neither side had been able to access before, crewed in part by both species for the first time in history. It would not be the last convoy, it would be the first of many. And on Earth, in a quiet part of the country where the air was clean and the nights showed the stars without interference, Jake Harris sat on the back porch of his family's house and looked up at the sky for a long time. He did not say anything. He just looked. The stars looked back, the way they always had, full of everything that was still out there waiting. And he went inside when it got cold, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the mug in both hands, and let the quiet of the house settle around him. There was more work in the morning. There was always more work in the morning. He was looking forward to it.